So our work in Florida was over. Now I had to organize the acceptance of the messweepers being transferred to us. Ships of this class were very necessary for the Soviet Navy in the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Riga in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, the Barents Sea, and even the Kara Sea. Hitlerites put thousands of mines. Our fleet, providing the flanks of the advancing Red Army, was already operating off the coast of Germany and its satellites. Hundreds of minesweepers tirelessly cleared the way for warships and transports, and yet they were not enough. Especially needed were minesweepers capable of fighting complex non-contact mines, in particular magnetic and hydrodynamic. Soviet scientists before the war, as well as in the first year of the Great Patriotic War, created electromagnetic trawls, and soon they came into service of our fleet. It was very important to receive American minesweepers equipped with the latest mine countermeasures. Admittedly, I did not expect to encounter difficulties in the acceptance of minesweepers. Maybe I was spoiled by good business relations formed in Miami with McDaniel and his successor Harrison. But the work from the very beginning did not go too smoothly. First of all, it was necessary to decide where we will give us the ships. The main training center trawler forces of the American Navy was located at the base of Little Rock, near Norfolk. It would seem that this is where we should train our crews and transfer the ships. I was about to go to Norfolk to solve all the organizational issues on the spot, but the Maritime Ministry did not inform about its decision. Finally, we were informed that the training and transfer of minesweepers will take place at the base Tompkinsville, located on the Hudson River. Well, we decide not us, but the owners. On November 13th, I gave a farewell reception in Miami in honor of Vice Admiral Bradley, Chief of Naval Training Centers. After the exchange of toasts with the expression of mutual feelings of respect, the atmosphere became less formal, and the Admiral, with the directness peculiar to Americans, began to ask about our impressions of the training system adopted in the U.S. Navy, about the peculiarities of training sailors and officers in our country. Bradley, as well as many other Americans, was interested in how we achieve a deep knowledge of technology in the personnel, the ability not only to operate mechanisms and equipment, but also to repair them. In response, I said that, as far as I have noticed the training centers of the U.S., Navy seek to teach only the combat use of equipment and the elementary basics of its operation. Theory is not honored. In case of failure of a device or mechanism, is replaced by a new one, and the removed one goes to special workshops for repair or scrap. The Soviet Navy has a different approach. A sailor, let alone an officer, must be able to eliminate any, even the most complex malfunction. After all, if a ship is at sea, you cannot count on the help of repair specialists. That is why we strive for our sailors to know their equipment both theoretically and practically. He who knows the theoretical basics will always master the practice of operation, and even more so the combat use, I finished. If it is your system of training that leads to the fact that in the Shell Beach Training Center Soviet anti-aircraft gunners shot down almost all cones and towing planes will soon have nothing to do, and your hydroacoustics so well keep contact with submarines, then I admire its results. After bidding a warm farewell to Capt. Harrison, I left by car for New York. For the last time I had the opportunity to drive along the entire Atlantic coast of the country, from Florida to New York. We traveled in a caravan, all 3 cars of the brigade. I was driving the lead car. For 4 days we traveled almost 1,500 miles. Already in New York, I did not get into the right lane and could not turn to the building of our Amtorg. In the stream of thousands of cars I had to rush through the whole of Manhattan. I did not know the city well, and it was unclear how to get to Amtorg. I decided to orient myself by the Empire State Building, a skyscraper visible from everywhere, a building of 102 floors, near which our Amtorg was located. So, bearing this landmark, and arrived at the final point of our journey. In New York, we were immediately overwhelmed with business. I busied myself with preparations for the accommodation of the crews and their training. To achieve all this in Tompkinsville was not easy. The base did not have the necessary equipment. The Americans had to deliver equipment for the training rooms, install it, find rooms. After inspecting the ships, I understood why we were not allowed to Norfolk. The Maritime Ministry was afraid that we would not notice that the Soviet fleet is transferred to the minesweepers with an incomplete set of equipment. Here, in Tompkinsville, there were only those minesweepers, which were transferred to the USSR. What happened in 43rd with radars was repeated. At the end of November, we were informed about the numbers of 12 ships to be transferred. Trawlers of the UMS type with a displacement of 350 tons were built in the United States in large series. Their wooden hulls were unified. They were used for both UMS minesweepers and anti-submarine patrol ships, the so-called patrol craft submarine. Thus, these ships differed from each other only in armament. UMS, along with electromagnetic trawl and trawl for contact mines, also had anti-submarine depth bombs and sonar, which allowed it to be used for anti-submarine warfare. A 75mm gun and 3 automatic rifles made up its artillery armament. The strength of the plating of the minesweepers was not designed for navigation in freezing seas. Therefore, at our request, an additional ice belt of planking made of thick oak planks was put on all ships. After this work was completed and the minesweepers left the dock, the acceptance could begin. For acceptance of the ships, a group was formed under the command of T. Karuno. It included MNS Samoilov and other officers and petty officers. Lieutenant Heiksinen, already mentioned by me, and Lieutenant Gagarin, a young man from a family of white emigrants, were still assigned to us as liaison officers from the US. Navy and interpreters. The trials of the minesweepers began at the end of the year. Harsh winter and ice appeared on the Hudson River, forced in early January 1945, temporarily stopped going to sea, as the voyage of ships with wooden hulls was prohibited. In February they resumed. But by that time I had already received a new responsible assignment. As early as November 7th, 1944, at a reception at the Soviet ambassador to the United States Andrei Andreevich Gromyko on the occasion of the 27th anniversary of October, I spoke with Commander Smith of the Maritime Ministry. "Captain," he said, "maybe you will soon receive from us already steel ships for your steel men." Smith's words were probably in response to my speech at a reception in Miami on the occasion of the completion of the transfer of 34 big hunters to the Soviet Navy. I said then that we were grateful for the wooden ships handed over to the Soviet Union. With crews of our men of steel, they would contribute to the defeat of Hitler's Germany. Thus the commander confirmed the rumors about the impending delivery of frigates to us, and I thanked him for the pleasant news. But what do these ships represent? Once settled in Tompkinsville, I decided to familiarize myself with the frigates and corvettes that were stationed at the nearby pier. I asked the interpreter Gagarin to help me visit the ships. He hesitated, and then said that permission from the Maritime Ministry was required. But such permission may not be needed if the commanders of the frigate and corvette invite me to visit their ships as a neighbor. I objected. Gagarin smiled and promised to try. A few days later, he relayed the corvette commander's invitation. I must say that the interpreter was pleased that it was possible to fulfill my request. I don't know how his immigrant parents felt about their former homeland, but their son was always loyal, even benevolent, and helped us as much as he could. So I visited the corvette, and the commander took me through all the combat stations and rooms and told me about the combat capabilities of his ship. The corvette was built in Canada and had a displacement of 725 tons. Steam engines allowed to develop a course of up to 17 knots. Artillery armament of the corvette consisted of one 102mm universal gun and anti-aircraft guns. Anti-submarine armament consisted of bomb launchers and depth bombs. 2 days later, I was able to visit the frigate. This ship had more combat capabilities than the corvette, although its steam engines, and did not allow to develop a course of more than 19 knots. For its displacement, frigate had a fairly strong armament, 376.2mm universal guns, 2 40mm and 9 20mm automatic rifles, and 9 bomblets type Hedgehog, each of which could give a salvo of 24 depth bombs with contact fuses. Thus, when on January 9th, Rear Admiral A. Yakimov informed me that I was to participate in the acceptance of the ships being transferred to the Soviet Pacific Fleet, I already had an idea of what I would have to deal with. The agreement to transfer to the Soviet Union frigates, AD-UMS minesweepers, large hunters, landing craft, torpedo boats, as well as floating workshops and small tankers, a total of more than 250 units, as the Admiral explained, was the result of negotiations in Yalta. It was to be assumed that the time of our country's entry into the war with militaristic Japan was not far off. I was instructed to coordinate with the Maritime Ministry organizational issues. It was necessary to develop a program of acceptance of ships, to determine the bases in which it will be made, to agree on the training of crews and solve hundreds of other issues. A number of difficulties had to be met at once. The fact is that the agreement on the transfer of ships to the Pacific Fleet did not provide for the restoration of motor resources of the ships, regardless of the period of their operation in the U.S. Navy. There was no stipulation of the procedure for conducting tests at sea and transfer of the ships from the American crew to the Soviet crew on the move, i.e., with the mechanisms in operation which had already been established in the practice of acceptance. Not a word was said about the order of preliminary training of Soviet sailors and provision of appropriate technical means for the training process, about the order of technical supply. Thus, the text of the agreement gave the Americans the opportunity to hand over to us the ships in the condition in which they were without any repairs. But there was nothing to be done. We could only hope that we would be able to achieve something on the spot, during the direct acceptance of the ships. Among other worries, we did not forget about interpreters. The Maritime Ministry said that we could not worry about the translation of technical documentation. A special translation bureau had been working for a long time, and all descriptions and instructions would arrive on time, and we would get translators liaison officers. In the first days of March, we basically prepared for acceptance and prepared to fly to Cold Bay, a naval base in Alaska. Having learned that the commander of this base, Capt. Maxwell, had arrived in Washington, I decided to see him to clarify the organization of the upcoming work. Already on the train, J. Heikkinen, who was accompanying me, informed me that A., the one who had been removed from Miami with considerable difficulty, was assigned to us as an interpreter. I immediately asked the lieutenant to inform Capt. Maxwell that a DOT's presence in Alaska was highly undesirable for us. Heikkinen complied with this request, and the question of a DOT's work at Cold Bay Base was dropped. However, he was assigned to the same translation bureau that worked on the technical documentation. Looking ahead, I will say that by June only the instructions for using the coffee grinder, titanium boilermaker, galley stove and refrigerator had been translated into Russian. This is all that the bureau has done for a month of work. Our friend was obviously not involved. After all matters with Capt. Maxwell had been settled, a group was formed to receive the ships at Cold Bay. It included officers P.A. Favorov, T.N. Banin, K.P. Sergeyev, excellent specialists, well known to me from joint work in Miami, as well as V.T. Arutyunian and I, Nikolaev. On March 20th, 1945, our group flew to Alaska. Together with us, N.P. Serbin, deputy head of the Marine Department of the Procurement Commission, flew to Cold Bay. Our first task was to check the readiness of the Cold Bay base. All matters concerning the acceptance of the UMS minesweepers in Tompkinsville were entrusted to the division commander G.T. Karuno. Literally on the eve of departure, A.A. Yakimov and our naval attaché, A. Gorishev, congratulated me on the promotion to the rank of Captain First Rank. The flight on the Douglas from Washington to Alaska took 3 days. After intermediate landings in Kansas City, San Diego, Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, and Anchorage, our plane finally landed at Cold Bay Base. Along with my companions, I stepped onto the snow-covered field of a small airfield. Small houses were visible at its edge, and in the distance, to the northeast and south, the white peaks of the mountains glistened. A few sailors in picturesque fur suits loaded the baggage onto the sleds. Shaggy sled dogs pulled them in the direction of the huts. We also headed that way. The base commander, Capt. Maxwell, met our group near the village. Having left our things in the cozy hut, assigned to us and dressed warmly, we went to the mess hall. After a hearty breakfast, Maxwell suggested we start looking around the base. The base in Cold Bay on the Alaska Peninsula was established by the Americans in 1942, after the Japanese captured the 2 western islands of the Aleutian Archipelago, Attu and Kuska. In the valley surrounded by hills, an airfield and a town were hastily built to accommodate the Marine Corps units they were preparing to land on the Japanese-occupied islands. However, the landing of Americans on Attu took place only in May 1943. 20 days defended their positions Japanese garrison under the command of Colonel Yamazaki 2,500 soldiers and officers, and this despite the fourfold superiority of the Americans on land, complete domination at sea and in the air. From the sea, the landing force was supported by powerful artillery three-line ships. To take possession of the island of Kaiska were concentrated even greater forces. During 18 days, the island was exposed to bombardment of five-line ships and bombardment from the air. Finally, on August 16th, 34,000 American and Canadian soldiers and officers landed on Kiska, and only then it turned out that the Japanese evacuated their 5,000th garrison on July 29th. With the liberation of Attu and Kaiska, the base in Cold Bay was not needed. And only after the Maritime Ministry chose it as a point of transfer of ships to the Soviet Pacific Fleet, the facilities were ordered to be dismantled and prepared to receive the Russians. Together with Capt. Maxwell, we walked around the prefabricated metal barracks houses insulated with pressed cardboard. Each was designed to accommodate a platoon. They were heated by solar stoves. We saw well-equipped showers and laundry, diesel power station and boiler room, automatic bakery, galley, canteens. The base also had a club with a spacious movie hall and a hospital made of several houses connected by covered passages. Everything was in good condition, and I was once again convinced of the ability of Americans to organize life with maximum comfort, regardless of where it has to do it in Florida or Alaska. But I had to tell Maxwell that Cold Bay was not prepared for training incoming Soviet crews, except for a room for training hydroacoustics. There was no training equipment. The base's small workshops could not provide the necessary repairs on the ships, and repairs might be needed. The base commander referred to the lack of instructions from Washington on the preparation of the appropriate training center in Cold Bay, but agreed to give the Maritime Ministry telegram with a list of our wishes. At the same time, he requested from the command of the naval base Dutch Harbor equipment for repair shops and training rooms. In turn, N.P. Serbin informed Rear Admiral A. Yakimov of our conclusions. Days passed, but neither we nor Maxwell did not receive a response from Washington. Neither did the Naval Department of our Procurement Commission react to my telegram with a request to provide Cold Bay with training facilities or to obtain American consent to the creation of a temporary training detachment consisting of ships of the types to be transferred to us minesweepers, barge submarine hunters, frigate and landing craft. We could only hope for personal connections, for mutual understanding and favourable attitude of the responsible officers in the Maritime Ministry and at the Dutch Harbour base. Soon from Dutch Harbour, Maxwell was informed that the request for equipment for training rooms will be satisfied. Of course, the commander of the base Dutch Harbour made this decision with the knowledge of the Maritime Ministry, but as if independently Washington, as it is called, saved face, remaining faithful to the letter of the previously agreed document. However, we were not interested in subtleties. In a few days, almost everything necessary for training rooms was delivered to Cold Bay, and a floating repair shop arrived. The personnel of the base, with the active participation of our officers, began to install the equipment. At the same time, we prepared training programs for Soviet sailors by specialties, made up planned tables of acceptance of ships, working out organizational and firing tasks in the base and at sea outings. In spite of some difficulties, the work was successful, and the news about the departure of transports with Pacific sailors from Vladivostok to Cold Bay received at the end of March did not take us by surprise. The Americans were not slow either. On April 4th came the first ships intended for the Soviet fleet's 6 a.m. type minesweepers, and the next day Maxwell called me to my office. Commodore Nikitin, listen to the radio. Your country has announced the termination of the non-aggression treaty with Japan. I hope we will soon become allies in the Pacific as well. After that, the base commander and his officers became more alert to our requests, faster to solve numerous organizational issues. It became clear to us that the ships should be accepted. As soon as possible, the change of the military and political situation in the Far East is a matter of urgency. During these days, I carefully studied maps and logs allocated to us for combat training at sea training grounds. It was necessary to understand properly the conditions of navigation in a navigationally complex area, replete with underwater dangers. It was curious to read Russian names on the map: Bayan Islands, Pavlova and Pogorely volcanoes, Pankova Reef, and many others. It is not without reason, that there are so many Russian names on the map of the entire coast of Northwest America. Russian navigators were the discoverers of this part of the continent. In the vicinity of the base we even came across an old cemetery with crosses on which we could still hardly distinguish inscriptions in Cyrillic alphabet. For the first time our compatriots sailed to the shores of Northwest America in the first half of the XVII century. At the end of August 1732, the ship Gabriel, which left Kamchatka, overcoming the storms of the harsh Bering Sea, approached the shores of Alaska. Captain Mikhail Gvozdev and navigator Ivan Fyodorov anchored their ship near the peninsula, which now bears the name of Sjord. Several years passed. In the summer of 1741, the ships of the Second Kamchatka expedition left Petropavlovsk and headed for the shores of North America. St. Peter, commanded by Vitus Bering, crossed the Gulf of Alaska and approached the coast of America in the area of Kayak Island. Navigators saw here one of the highest peaks of Alaska, the eternally snow-covered Mount St. Elijah Bering was not destined to return from the voyage. He was buried on the Commander Islands. The second ship of the expedition, St. reached the American continent in the area of the Alexander Archipelago, much further south. Its captain Alexei Chirikov led his ship along the Aleut Ridge on the way back and returned safely to Petropavlovsk. In the following years, vessels of Russian industrialists, sea beast miners, regularly made voyages to the Aleutian Islands and the shores of Northwest America. In 1784, Grigory Shelikov founded the first Russian permanent settlement in America on Kadyak Island, which later became known as Pavlovskaya Harbor. Shelikov and Golikov established the United American Company, which existed until 1867. The company's activity was determined by the privileges granted by the Russian government. They stated upon the discovery of the coast of America by Russian seafarers from ancient times, America, starting from 55° north latitude, and the ridges of islands extending from Kamchatka northward to America and southward to Japan, and by right of possession of them by Russia, the company shall use all the trades and establishments now located on the coast of America from the above-mentioned 55° to the Bering Strait and beyond it, also on the Aleutian, Kuril and other islands lying in the northeastern ocean, to make her new discoveries not only above 55° north latitude, but also beyond it further south, and to occupy the lands discovered by her in the Russian possession on the previously prescribed rules, if they were not occupied by other nations and did not enter into their dependence. The energetic ruler of the Russian-American Company, A. Baranov. Baranov pushed the boundaries of its possessions. Founded in 1804 on Sitka Island, Novoarkhangelsk became the center of Russia's possessions in America, and in 1813 Russian settlements appeared in California. Since 1803, when ships under the command of I.F. Krusenstern and Y.F. Lysyansky left Kronstadt for the shores of Russian America, the round-the-world voyages of the Russian fleet began. Many things in our history are somehow connected with Russian America. But in 1867, the Tsarist government sold Russian America to the United States. Having received the news of Alexander I's consent on the night of March 30th, Secretary of State Seward ordered his department to open at 4 o'clock in the morning to sign the treaty, as if not to miss. For $7 and a bit million, the U.S. had acquired a colossal amount of territory. After 1867, most of the Russian settlers left Alaska, but the Russian cultural influence did not disappear. In 1929, an airplane called the Land of Soviets flew from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky to the U.S. Pacific coast. At the airfields of Attu and Unalashka Islands, Soviet pilots were greeted by the descendants of the inhabitants of re-inhabitants of Russian America, Russians and Aleuts, some of whom could still explain themselves in Russian. In general, the Russian period in the history of Northwest America is not forgotten in the United States. During our stay in Miami, we even once watched a certain Hollywood masterpiece, the main character of which was A. Baranov. The ruler of the Russian-American Company was depicted in it as an exuberant merchant in a hat with a peacock feather, surrounded by typical characters of westerns. In the spring of the 45th, however, we had no time for excursions into history. On April 10th to 12th, transports with Soviet sailors came to Cold Bay. It was necessary to accommodate, feed, and then organize the training of 1,590 sailors and petty officers, 200 officers and 32 accompanying interpreters. Then arrived the commander of the detachment of received ships, Rear Admiral D. Popov, and his chief of staff, Captain 2nd Rank E.M. Simonov. In these days, April 12th, we learned of the death of U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We were surprised by the indifference with which American officers and sailors met this news. Our condolence expressed to Capt. Maxwell was not only of an official nature. After all, President Roosevelt during the Second World War actively advocated the strengthening of the anti-fascist coalition, repeatedly spoke of his desire to strengthen in the post-war period of cooperation between the US and the USSR. We could only guess about the policy that Harry Truman would pursue. The life of Soviet sailors in Cold Bay immediately acquired its clear rhythm. There were classes on studying of technical means and armament in training rooms on the shore. There was an acceptance of the ships, began to go to sea to pass training and combat tasks. In the evenings in the club of the base, Soviet and American sailors watched movies together. The Americans had great success with Chapiev and Two Soldiers. Unfortunately, more and more difficulties arose in the acceptance of ships. When checking the technical condition of the first AM-type minesweepers, it turned out that many mechanisms have already exhausted most of the established resources, but the prescribed repairs did not pass. It was necessary to replenish the sets of spare parts and tools. Some devices were presto faulty or regulated. This was a consequence of the American attempt to give us the ships as they were. It is clear that neither I nor other Soviet officers could not allow the acceptance of our fleet of defective and not fully equipped with all necessary warships after all. They were soon to take part in hostilities. And here arose my first conflict with Capt. Maxwell. I demanded to eliminate defects in the mechanisms of the ships by our personnel, but under the guidance of American specialists and logistical support from the base. It was clear that the issue was of principle. If we did not achieve in this case the satisfaction of our demands, then from now on all claims will be rejected automatically. In the end, after long negotiations, Maxwell agreed to reassembly of auxiliary mechanisms on 2 ships. I want to prove to you, Commodore Nikitin, he said, that the claims of Russian mechanics are unfounded. Since the ships sailed, it means that their mechanisms are in quite decent condition. I will be glad if you are right, but if our suspicions are confirmed, we will open the mechanisms on all the ships. We'll see, Maxwell said glumly. Examination of the mechanisms confirmed our fears. On some auxiliary engines bearings were worn out, could soon fail altogether. But even this did not convince the base commander. No matter what you write to Washington, I, for my part, will report that the reassembly of engines is not necessary. Let's give this telegram: all auxiliary engines have run time without inspection from 1,000 to 2,000 hours. The same for some of the main engines. The instructions of the manufacturers and the corresponding fleet instructions provide for inspection or preventive repair for auxiliary engines after 500 hours and for main engines after 400 hours. We ask permission to carry out inspections and repairs or change the requirements of the instructions. Agreed? But even here Maxwell, using the fact that B.D. Popov flew to Washington, did not compromise. It was possible, however, to obtain permission to conduct random inspections of mechanisms. It should be said that the captain, a man of great experience, in the recent past, the flagship mechanic of the battleship Connection, understood the fairness of our demands. But, since the base did not have the necessary spare parts and Washington refused to send them, he was forced to take a tough stance and responded with a constant refusal to all our proposals. The next day the dispute resumed and the conversation was very heated. We did not hesitate in expressions. Maxwell spoke Russian quite well. Arguments with the captain wore me out. After Maxwell repeatedly told me that there would be no repairs, I felt a pain in my heart, and without saying another word, went to my room. At the cottage I took some bromine and lay down. The next day I was still feeling ill, and did not meet with the base commander in the morning as usual. Captain learned from T.N. Banin about my illness and in the evening came by, as he said, for peace talks. Let's not quarrel, Commodore Nikitin. I'm hot, and so are you. But I can't disobey Washington's orders. But we can't accept ships with engines that fail at sea. Don't you understand that? We don't take in ships for parades. I understand. I've even sent to Dutch Harbour for spare parts and supplies. Make the necessary repairs. I have to tell you, we have different procedures. On one of the battleships of the Connection, where I was the flagship mechanic at sea, the support bearing of the propeller shaft failed. The other battleship had a spare bearing, and I offered to make repairs by personnel. But the Admiral, the commander of the Connection, said that there was nothing to do, not their own business, and the battleship went to the base for repair. So we had to make sure that our most urgent needs were met. Doing this was not easy, and every day became more difficult after Truman became president. The attitude toward us has deteriorated markedly. Maxwell apparently felt the change in the situation and not without reason feared for his career. The long-awaited Victory Day came. On May 9, 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany was celebrated in Cold Bay with the ceremonial hoisting of the Soviet Navy and American flags. It is difficult to convey the feelings of joy and pride for the distant motherland that engulfed all of us, Soviet sailors. But we all realized that militaristic Japan would continue the war. In Manchuria, there was still a large part of its land forces. Only the defeat of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria and Korea could sober up the Japanese militarists and force them to capitulate. So it was necessary to accelerate the acceptance of warships from the American side, to send them faster to the ports of the Soviet Far East. After the battle won by Maxwell, the acceptance went on without any major incidents. But still it was impossible to calm down and delay Rear Admiral B.D. Popov, who returned from a trip to Washington on May 19th, said that the Maritime Ministry expects in the near future to cease deliveries under Lend-Lease, and therefore the transfer of ships to us. Therefore Popov was advised to accept the ships as they were, without any repairs. This good advice should have been understood as a clear pressure take. They say what they give, or you will not get it. Together with Rear Admiral B.D. Popov, P.A. Favorov flew to Cold Bay. Pyotr Alexeyevich told about the course of acceptance of minesweepers of the UMS type in Tompkinsville. The first group of 6 ships has already been manned with crews arrived through Portland and is preparing for the passage to the Baltic. The departure is scheduled for May 25th. Transition from the US to the USSR second group, intended for the Black Sea Fleet, is expected in the first half of June. This was good news in the Baltic and the Black Sea. The fleet had a great need for minesweepers. Thousands of mines were to be etched there to ensure the safe navigation of merchant and fishing vessels. At the end of May, the first 2 groups of ships accepted from the Americans left Cold Bay for Vladivostok, 11 minesweepers and 6 large submarine hunters. Acceptance of other ships of these classes, as well as frigates and landing ships, continued. As was once the case with the hunters in Miami and minesweepers in Tompkinsville, the Americans removed a number of types of equipment from the ships transferred to us. I was convinced of this when I visited a frigate that came to Cold Bay under the flag of the U.S. Coast Guard, which was not intended for the USSR. The commander kindly showed me his ship. I paid attention to the radar rangefinders of 76mm universal guns. The frigates we received did not have them. A few days later, inspecting with Maxwell another frigate, I asked, as if by the way, to give instructions to paint on the shields of the guns those places from where the radar rangefinders were removed, so as not to cause the inevitable questions of our sailors. Captain had no choice but to swallow this pill, and he remained silent. During these same days, a powerful ocean rescue tug came to Cold Bay. I had never been on such ships before, and I decided to ask its commander for permission to inspect it. I had seen such a rescue tugboat in Miami, but I could not get on it then. The commander was our former interpreter, Konstantin Peterson. He met me with sincere joy and great cordiality. "Nice spike, isn't it, Commodore?" he asked after we passed the tug. One could sense that Peterson was proud of his ship, pleased to be in command. At parting, he gave a gift of photo of his ship. This was my last meeting with K. Peterson, an officer of the U.S. Navy. I kept the kindest memory of him. The transfer of ships in Cold Bay has adjusted. and I decided to check how prepared for the transition from the US to the Black Sea minesweepers, second group. Having received permission, I flew together with T.N. Banin to Washington. A little earlier, P.A. Favorov left Alaska. He was assigned to supervise the acceptance of sea tugs in Texas. At first, our airplane landed in San Francisco. After the annoying winds of Alaska, their speed often exceeded 40 miles per hour. After 5 degrees of heat, or even zero temperature, which persisted throughout May in Cold Bay, California met us with serene blue sky and heat. From San Francisco, we flew on a parallel eastward. The crew commander kindly invited me to his cabin, where I spent most of the flight. Entrusting the airplane to the autopilot, the pilot showed me the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the canyons that cut through them, and told me about the history of the states, the lands of which opened under the wing of the airplane. From a height of 8,000 feet, the panorama of the far west left an unforgettable impression. Americans love their country, are proud of its history, although not always objective. The pilot spared no time and effort, and during this air journey I got a good lesson in geography and history of the United States. We landed safely at the Washington Military Airfield. After reporting to Rear Admiral A. Yakimov on the state of affairs with the acceptance of ships at Cold Bay, I met with Capt. Schulman and Pahlman at the Naval Ministry. I asked these officers, who were in charge of the logistical arrangements for the transfer of the ships to our fleet, not to obstruct the inspection and necessary repairs of machinery. We do not ask for anything extra, only compliance with the motor standards and instructions of the firms, only compliance with the regulations in force in your fleet, I finished. Schulman, formerly flagship mechanic to Admiral C. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, made no definite promises. We could only hope that the conversation would not be wasted. Having finished my business at the Naval Ministry, I hurried to New York. In Tompkinsville was preparing to move to Sevastopol group of minesweepers. The commander of the division, Captain 3rd Rank G. T. Karuno, told me in detail about the difficulties that had to be overcome with the first group of minesweepers that had already left for the Baltic. The fact is that the Soviet crews for the minesweepers arrived very late. The ships were received by our petty officers and officers from the reserve of the brigade I commanded in Miami. Because of their great experience and excellent knowledge of the machinery, the reception was largely completed by the time the crews arrived. Therefore, as soon as the train delivered the Soviet sailors from Portland to New York, G.T. Karuno immediately organized accelerated training of personnel in training rooms. In a short time, sailors, petty officers and officers mastered the technical means and weapons of the ships and began to complete the acceptance of minesweepers and work out the combat organization. Incidentally, such rapid mastering of the minesweepers by the Soviet crews revived the legend that all Russians are disguised engineers. Undoubtedly, this success was achieved in no small measure due to the selfless work of the flagship mechanic of our brigade M.N. Samoilov, divisional specialists A.N. Matrokov, V.P. Sadokov, A.A. Filimonov, A.R. Kuzin. The merits of M.N. Samoilov are especially great. Thanks to his efforts, our sailors quickly mastered the technical means of the electromechanical warfare unit, and all crews were trained in the training center for the fight for survivability on ships. Flagmech also well prepared the personnel for the operation of the mechanisms. In this he was helped by his own extensive experience of long-distance campaigns. In 1939, Samoilov participated in the passage of 5 Soviet minesweepers from Kronstadt to the Far East, being the commander of the electromechanical combat unit of one of the ships. The inspection of preparation for the transition to the Black Sea of the second group of minesweepers showed that the personnel had mastered the ships well and knew their duties. The mood of the Soviet sailors was excellent. Everyone was looking forward to returning to the homeland. Young officers A.M. Saishev I, Komyakov, T.M. Bibikov, M.Z., Lopatko, V.N. Nikolaev and A. Nikolaev and A. Zhukov, commanders of minesweepers, were well prepared for the long-distance campaign. With the New Yorkers in our sailors, petty officers and officers immediately established good relations. Ordinary Americans were not stingy in showing friendly feelings. I was told of an elderly woman who presented one of the crew with a huge cake baked by her own hand. A rally at Madison Square Garden on Victory Day, attended by sailors from the division, was a real demonstration of the friendly feelings of New Yorkers toward our country. Soviet soldiers were greeted, their hands were shaken, and souvenirs were given. Citizens of New York, men and women, tried, as far as possible, to express their respect for our country, admiration for the feat of the Red Army and Navy, which defeated the Nazi invaders. On the eve of the departure of the UMass minesweepers to the Black Sea, I invited Capt. Hill, the commander of the Tompkinsville base, for a cocktail. The evening passed in a warm atmosphere, and we parted as friends. The next day, after seeing our ships off across the ocean, I flew to Cold Bay. In the 10 days that I was away, 3 more groups of ships had left for Vladivostok: 7 minesweepers, 12 submarine hunters, and 14 infantry landing ships. But the number of Soviet Pacific sailors did not decrease. Hundreds of Red Fleets, petty officers and officers arrived in Cold Bay on transports. By the end of May, several more groups of ships left from Cold Bay, with a call to Adak base on Aleutians for resupply to Vladivostok. In addition, 12 torpedo boats of Captain 3rd Rank M.G. Malik were delivered to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky by transports. I have already mentioned earlier that the crews of this division were trained at the Torpedo Boat Training Center in Melville. From Petropavlovsky, these torpedo boats safely made the passage of several hundred miles to Vladivostok. It was a good test of the boat's seaworthiness and crew's training. I had long wanted to visit some base of the American fleet on the Aleutian Islands, and I was interested in the Aleutians themselves. They said that there were preserved monuments of those years when these islands were part of Russia. And now such an opportunity unexpectedly presented itself. Rear Admiral B.D. Popov and I were invited to breakfast by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commander of the American fleet in the North Pacific. We had to fly to the guests on the airplane sent for us by Fletcher from Cold Bay to Adak Island, where the Vice Admiral's headquarters was located. The distance is decent, something about 700 miles. After breaking through the low cloud, Douglas made a proper before landing circle over the island and landed. At the gangway we were met by the commander of the Naval District, Rear Admiral Wood. He greeted the representatives of the Russian Navy on behalf of Vice Admiral Fletcher and invited us into the jeep that had pulled up to the airplane. 10 minutes drive, and we are already in the center of a small village. The commander came out of his cottage and said that he was glad to meet with Russian allies. The table was already set and we were immediately invited to have breakfast. The host turned out to be an interesting conversationalist. At first he told us a lot about his participation in the war in the Pacific, about the battles with the Japanese fleet. The interpreter could not keep up with the Admiral's fast, emotional speech, but I understood almost everything without translation. It was clear that F.D. Fletcher, who began the war as commander of the operational unit, a convinced supporter of aircraft carriers. His conviction in this, he confirmed the examples of fighting in the Coral Sea in May 1942. As you know, the outcome of this battle was decided by aviation. The ships of the opponents never came close to the distance of artillery fire. I listened with interest to the story about the battle at Midway Island in June 1942, during which the Americans destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Then the 16th and 17th operational compounds under the command of F.D. Fletcher at the very beginning of the battle, a powerful strike aircraft carrier aviation, in a few minutes sunk Kaga, Akagi and Soryu, 3 heavy Japanese aircraft carriers. However, the Japanese planes managed to retaliate by hitting heavy damage to the aircraft carrier Yorktown, which held the flag Fletcher. The Americans again won the battle, being 150 miles from the enemy. The Japanese retreated. After that, our enemy in the Pacific could not recover, gentlemen. In the last 3 years we have launched 1 aircraft carrier after another. The number of aircraft carriers, not battleships, has ensured dominance at sea, finished Fletcher. The meaning of the Admiral's words was clear. The U.S. Navy, possessing powerful aircraft carrier formations, henceforth dominates and will dominate the world's oceans. Time will tell, I thought. Soon our conversation took a more casual character. The Admiral recalled his youth, funny and at the same time dramatic cases from his naval service. He had a lot to tell. He commanded a destroyer and a cruiser, was a pilot of naval aviation, commanded a submarine and aircraft carrier. In short, before becoming the commander of an operational unit, which included aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, Fletcher went through a great school. I think that this contributed to his formation as the best in the US. Navy commander of operational formations that made a significant contribution to the defeat of Japanese squadrons in a number of sea battles. During the cocktail, we could not do without anecdotes about phlegmatic British, which are so fond of telling in the United States. A convoy is coming across the Atlantic, Fletcher began, smiling in advance. The sonar operator reports to the corvette commander that he hears submarine noises. The acoustician reports that he hears the noises of a second submarine. The commander replies that it must be the second whale. Just then a torpedo explosion rumbles, hitting the side of the corvette. "That's a submarine," says the commander. At the airfield, from which we had to go on the return trip, went together with Wood and Brown, Rear Admiral, commander of the 91st Operational Connection of Heavy Cruisers. But we didn't get to fly that day. Meteorologists reported dense, low fog over the entire Aleutian Range and the Alaska Peninsula. While we were at the airfield waiting for permission to take off, I asked one of the officers if there were any monuments of the era of the Russian-American company on Adak. He replied that nothing seemed to have been preserved on Adak. But on Kadiak Island, in the Gulf of Alaska, there is a Russian settlement even now. On Unalaska, the island where the Dutch Harbour Naval Base is located, you can see St. Nicholas Church with an iconostasis of the XVI century, old Russian houses, and among them the building of the office of the Russian-American company. Even a few carefully protected trees, the only ones on the island, were planted by the Russians. Someone adds that the Aleuts, as a rule, have Russian names and surnames and go to the Russian church. Yes, it's a pity we can't visit Unalaska. The island is close to Adak, and there are probably occasions by sea, but now is not the time for a tour. The visit dragged on. When it became clear that the fog was unlikely to clear until the next morning, Admiral Budd invited us for a cocktail. He complained about Alaska's unstable weather. You don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes. The fog finds you instantly. The evening ended with a viewing of documentaries about the battles for Okinawa in April-June 1945. The cameraman shot an impressive picture of the movement to the island of many hundreds of landing ships, powerful strikes on the Japanese defense support ships, battleships, heavy cruisers and aircraft carriers and ships of other classes. I remembered the filmed close-up attacks of Japanese suicide pilots, kamikaze. Already after the war, it became known that during the battles near Okinawa, kamikaze destroyed 36 and damaged 386 ships. The comments of our host, who participated in the battle for Okinawa, were no less interesting. At the same time, I could not help but notice that the Americans, judging by the movies, in the area of operations had complete dominance at sea and in the air, a significant advantage on land, more than 450,000 soldiers against a garrison of 80,000 Japanese. American victory from the very beginning of the operation was only a matter of time. And yet the fighting for Okinawa was almost 3 months. The next day in the morning we flew to Cold Bay. From the porthole of the airplane gaining altitude, we saw leaving in the Sea Cruiser's operational connection of Rear Admiral Brown. Already after the war in the American Navy appeared in the destroyers of the type Fletcher. I think that the lead ship of this series was named in honor of our gracious host on Adak. During the whole July, the acceptance of ships from Americans went without any incidents. Before August 1st, 5 more groups left for Vladivostok. The Soviet Pacific Fleet received replenishment of anti-submarine forces. Still, we failed to fulfill the instruction of the Chief of the Main Naval Staff, Admiral S.G. Kucherov, to finish the acceptance of all ships transferred under the agreement with the US. By August 1st, of the 28 frigates we sent to the USSR, only 10. The rest were to arrive at Cold Bay during August. We understood that we should hurry. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration of the USSR, USA, Great Britain and France was published, containing the demand for Japan's surrender. On August 9th, 1945, the radio reported the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. That same day, Capt. Maxwell brought me congratulations. Commodore Nikitin, at last we are allies in the Pacific too. I hope the end of the war is just around the corner now, Cap N. That would be nice. I'll tell you a secret. I heard that the landing on the Japanese islands was planned only on the 46th. We listened to the Sovinform Bureau reports with excitement. The announcer named cities and settlements of Korea and Manchuria liberated by the Soviet troops. It was reported about the combat successes of torpedo boats, including the division of M.G. Malik, about the landing of our maritime landings in the Kurils, on South Sakhalin and the coast of North Korea. It was pleasant to realize that the ships received at Cold Bay were also taking part in the Pacific Fleet's combat operations. I followed on the map the operations of the Pacific, and every time I remembered the division commander MSMG, Bespalov, who became the commander of a brigade of frigates, young, well-trained commanders of ships, whom I recognized and had time to love in Alaska L.S. Mironov and MS Sagilenko, VP Morozov and MM Manyberkin, and many others, how I wanted to be there now, where the ships of the Pacific Fleet fought. During August, while the war with Japan was still going on, 30 more ships left Cold Bay for the ports of the Soviet Far East, including 12 frigates. To complete our part of the Lend-Lease program, it remained to hoist our Navy flag on 9 ships. The work could have been completed in a matter of days. But then the Americans began to delay the transfer under various pretexts, and the 4 remaining frigates were not presented for acceptance at all. Political changes in the highest governmental spheres in Washington had an impact. If at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences the USA and England insisted on the earliest possible entry of our country into the war against Japan, now after the defeat of the Kwantung Army and the liberation of Manchuria and North Korea, the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin by the Soviet armed forces, the ruling circles of the USA and England feared the strengthening of the military and political positions of our motherland in the Far East, feared the strengthening of the People's Liberation Army of China and the people's power in North Korea. The reassessment of our country's contribution to the victory over militaristic Japan began immediately. After the explosions of atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we often heard from American officers that the USSR's help was unnecessary, that the US could force the Mikado to surrender without the help of its allies. The sudden construction of the airfield in Cold Bay was also surprising equipment, and a special construction unit arrived on a large transport. Bulldozers, excavators, and rollers leveled the runway, followed by special machines rolled out a kind of carpet of metal plates. The work was finished in a few days. It became known that the U.S. Navy School on the island of Kadiak continues to operate, and its graduates, translators from Russian, are not intended to work with us. By the behavior of Maxwell, whose character I had time to study quite thoroughly, it was felt that in Cold Bay from day to day waiting for an order from the Maritime Ministry to terminate the agreement on Lend-Lease. B. Popov came to the conclusion that passively waiting for further developments cannot be. September 3rd, the day after receiving the news of the surrender of Japan, I escorted the Admiral to the airfield. But it seems we still delayed, because already on September 5th, Capt. Maxwell brought a telegram to our headquarters cottage. The commander of the Cold Bay base was ordered to stop the transfer of ships to the USSR and remove Soviet crews from those of them, which have not yet had time to raise our flag. Thus we had to give to the Americans even the ships, actually already accepted, but still undergoing the necessary course of combat training before going to Vladivostok. It seemed that we would not get the remaining 9 pennants. But on September 9th, B.D. Popov managed to reach an agreement in the Ministry of Marine that we would be given all the ships that were in Cold Bay and intended for the Soviet Navy, and the act would specify not the actual date of hoisting the Soviet flag, but September 4th. And now, more than 30 years later, I think that B.D. Popov was able to achieve such a decision of the Maritime Ministry only thanks to personal contacts. A lively, charming, very direct person, the Admiral impressed the Americans. He was able to find a common language and establish friendly relations with high-ranking officers of the U.S. Navy. Boris Dmitrievich could almost always convincingly prove the need to help the Russian ally in this or that particular case. Here helped and appealed to the long-standing historical ties between the two powers and convincing facts testifying to the decisive contribution of our country to the defeat of Hitler's Germany, and a reminder that together we will achieve a speedy victory over Japan. Thanks to the efforts of B.D. Popov, who returned to Cold Bay on September 12th, the acceptance of the ships resumed and proceeded without any misunderstandings. On September 15th, we saw off the last detachment. On the mainmast of one of the frigates, the flag of the junior flagman was hoisted. Rear Admiral B.D. Popopov, together with his staff, was leaving for Vladivostok. This is how our group finished the fulfillment of the governmental task. On the next day in the morning, we warmly bade farewell to Capt. Maxwell and American officers thanked our interpreters, gave memorable gifts on behalf of our group. Alaska saw us off with cold, continuously drizzling rain, but we felt good soon. Very soon we would meet our motherland. The Douglas was flying the familiar route to San Francisco, and from there to Washington. From San Francisco, my traveling companion and neighbor turned out to be an American colonel of the Air Force. He tells me that he visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the assignment of the Commission for the Study of Strategic Bombing of U.S. aircraft. I was struck by his apparent desire to present the atomic bomb as the most ordinary weapon, simply that instead of hundreds of airplanes with ordinary bombs, one could now be sent with an atomic bomb equivalent to them in destructive power. The colonel shows a photo of Hiroshima. After the atomic bomb explosion, you can see the destroyed charred wall of some house. He says that he has already seen something like this in Germany, studying the results of the bombing of Hamburg, Dresden, the cities of the Ruhr by American and British aircraft. Not a word about the hundreds of thousands of victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not a word about the terrible biological effect accompanying the atomic explosion. Did this officer ever realize the horror and senselessness of this barbaric act, committed by order of President Truman in the days when the surrender of Japan was a matter of days? Did he understand that the lives of thousands of civilians, women and children, were sacrificed for the sole purpose of frightening our country, the whole world, to herald, as some in the US believed, the beginning of a new American era? Or did he plan atomic strikes on the cities of the Soviet Union, taking into account the invaluable experience? Who knows? No matter how much we all wanted to return to our homeland faster, we had to spend more than 2 more months in the United States. It was necessary to help the Naval Department of our Purchasing Commission to complete its work to put all the affairs in order, to summarize what we had received under the Lend-Lease. Only in early December, together with the disbanded group of the Soviet Procurement Commission headed for the USSR, we sailed from New York on a transport bound for Odessa. For the last time, I looked at the enormous New York skyscrapers, at the Hudson, swarming with ships, ferries and boats, like Broadway with automobiles, at the famous Isle of Tears and, ironically, at the giant Statue of Liberty standing next to it. The ship sailed out into the ocean. I stood at the stern, gazing at the jagged silhouette of New York City floating away. I never visited the United States again, but I have always kept a good memory of ordinary Americans who sincerely wanted to help our homeland in the hard times of the Patriotic War, did everything in their power to do so. For 3 years, we got to know well the hard-working American people, saw the strong sides of the so-called American way of life, great technology, and the ability to use it, business and energetic people. But how often we were struck by the political and spiritual limitations of Americans, their peculiar self-centeredness. Sometimes it seemed that for them there was no other world but America. I can say with certainty that Soviet sailors, pilots, and our other specialists who were in the United States during World War II did a lot to make Americans learn the truth about our homeland and our people. Not everyone in the United States liked it. Our sailors who arrived in Seattle from Vladivostok were very warmly welcomed by ordinary Americans. The sidewalks were filled with people greeting Soviet officers and sailors. Captain Third Rank, NSA. Debelov, a tall, handsome officer who led the column of sailors through the city, told me afterward that this meeting was a demonstration of friendship and gratitude to the Soviet Union, to the Red Army, which had destroyed Paulus' army at Stalingrad and had just defeated the Nazis at Kursk. But after this joyful meeting, our crews arriving in the US began to be delivered to the echelons in buses, bypassing the city centre, and the echelons stopped at small stations. One must think that the choice of Cold Bay on the desolate coast of Alaska as a point for the transfer of ships to us was not accidental either. For 3 years we received in the USA and sent to the USSR more than 350 ships, various spare equipment. At the final stage of the Great Patriotic War in the Northern Fleet, and in the war with imperialist Japan, These ships took part in combat operations. In the post-war years, Achend and minesweepers of Uffair and types etched thousands of mines in the North, Baltic and Black Sea. But of course it should be taken into account that the Americans gave us mainly anti-submarine ships, submarine hunters and frigates, as well as minesweepers, which were not the striking force of the fleet. Only torpedo boats Vopers, Higgins and Elko could be used to conduct active combat operations on the coastal communications of the enemy. Passing us ships and boats, the Americans, of course, did not weaken their forces. The shipbuilding industry of the United States, working for the war in peaceful conditions, in abundance supplied its fleet everything it needed. I will note that the day came when the United States demanded the return of all ships and boats. This was in the late 50s, at the height of the Cold War. Well, we patched up what we had received in due time under Lend-Lease and returned it, although it was simply dangerous to transport the newly dismantled, barely alive torpedo boats by sea. On a quiet, cloudless day, our steamer entered the port of Odessa. In the city, on the way to the station, I noticed a lot of destruction. The clothes of the townspeople were poor, but life was boiling. The representative of the Black Sea Fleet, who met us, told us that the port accepts ships, factories are working. In the evening we left for Moscow. In the first days after my return to Moscow, I was received by I.S. Isakov, the chief of the main naval staff. Ivan Stepanovich listened attentively to the report on the work done in the United States, asked many questions about shipbuilding, training of personnel in the U.S. Navy. He was also interested in the organization of transitions to the USSR ships accepted by us. The admiral highly appreciated the naval training and courage of the Soviet crews. In the next year or two of work related to the testing of new boats, both torpedo and anti-submarine, is not expected, said Ivan Stepanovich. Now it is necessary to generalize the experience of the war at sea, to develop on its basis designs of boats. Here you and the cards in your hands, and it is necessary to train personnel for the fleet. This task is both difficult and very responsible. I think that soon we will offer you to do it. A new post-war page of the Navy service was opening.